Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning. Thank you for joining me here on Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute
more
of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are continuing our study. Now, like I've shared with you, I've got some things to share with you and connecting the dots that I think are just going to blow you away. And as I've shared with you already, I develop all of this information and a whole lot more in my book, Who is This Babylon? So please feel free to take advantage of that on my website. Order your own copy. Oh, and by the way, once again, I want to thank you I always have trouble with this, very, very much for the wonderful response to my brand spanking new book. It was only introduced last week. Entitled Temple to Telos. The premise of this book is the first century Jerusalem temple that was standing at the time of Christ and the apostles is the temple that had to be standing in conformity with the law of Moses, ministered over by the Levitical priesthood for the fulfillment of the final three feast days. I got to tell you, and I'm not laughing at anyone, I have just found it nonetheless amusing at some of the almost, absolutely ridiculous responses of people trying to escape the force of that argument. And the premise of this book, it never ceases to amaze me, honestly. The desperation of people trying to avoid the clear-cut teaching of the Bible. Now, that's everything from the time statements to the fact that the law of Moses was not nailed to the cross, but rather when Paul wrote Colossians, the feast days, the final three feast days, were still present, active, indicative, shadows of the good things that were about to come. They had not yet been fulfilled. And so, just this morning, when I was reading through some of the comments on YouTube that had been posted in response to some of my videos, individuals were saying, the law of Moses was annulled at the cross. No, it wasn't, because the feast days, when Paul wrote in Colossians 2, when Hebrews was written, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 23, the temple and the cultus and the feast days were still shadows of the things that had not yet come. Well, look, if they were still valid, if the shadows were still shadows, if the feast days were still shadows, then they hadn't been fulfilled, period. And if they weren't fulfilled, the law of Moses wasn't nailed to the cross. The law of Moses had not been annulled. And yet people still continue to make that argument. Now, I understand how challenging it is to change a paradigm. Yeah, I really do. But folks, the testimony is there. So do yourself a favor. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Beautiful banner right up at the very top. Introductory price for the month of December 2021, U.S. orders only. Now, if you live in a foreign country, and you'd like a copy of this, even at a reduced price, contact me and I'll sell you a PDF on certain conditions, okay? It's just important that you be willing to agree to certain conditions. So contact me about a reduced price. Okay, now then, as promised, I want to get back into Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 and to show the conflation between Isaiah 2 through 4, how Jesus uses it, how Paul uses it, how John uses it. They all use it in the exact same way. Now then, yesterday I shared with you Isaiah chapter 2, 10, and 12. Here's the last days, day of the Lord, when men could run to the hills, hide in the caves. Well, then, in verse 19 and following, he repeats it. They shall go into the holes of the rocks, into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord, from the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Now, Folks, when God said he was going to shake something, that means he was going to remove it. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, 25 and following as a good example of that. So here we have the last day's day of the Lord, when men could run to the mountains, hide in the caves, cry to the rocks, cry to the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the Lord, from the day of the Lord. By the way, this is directly parallel to Hosea chapter 10 and verse 8. Hosea and Isaiah are roughly contemporary with each other. They're both foretelling the same time and the same event. Although interestingly enough, Hosea adds some additional information, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Now watch. In that day, in what day? When men run to the rocks, hide in the caves, cry to the mountains, fall on us. In that day a man will cast away his idols of silver, his idols of gold, which they made each for himself to worship, to the moles and the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks, into the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. So twice we are told that this last day's day of the Lord is a time when men could run to the mountains. Now, I've said this before. Let me drive this home, okay? If this is talking about the day of the Lord at the end of the current Christian age, and remember, amillennials, postmillennialists tell us the Christian age is the last days. So if Isaiah chapter 2 is about the coming of the Lord at the end of the last days, somebody please tell me how anybody could have the time to run to the mountains, hide in the caves, cry to the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the terror of the Lord, from the glory of his majesty, when the Lord would arise to shake the earth, to remove the earth, to destroy the earth. I mean, after all, we're told the resurrection, which occurs on the last day of the last days, at the end of the age, we're told the resurrection is over in a moment. Boom, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. So how does anybody have a chance to run? John A.T. Robinson wrote in his book, The Coming of the Lord, years ago, back in the 50s, I think it was, this description of the day of the Lord hardly comports to the idea of a day of the Lord at some proposed end of time. Now, here's a little clue, ladies and gentlemen. This is a slight digression, but not really. Let me urge you to go to Ezekiel chapter 13 and verse 5. You want a description, you want a definition of the day of the Lord? Just go to Ezekiel chapter 13 and verse 5. The Lord said of the prophets, the false prophets that were in Israel at the time, and he said, they are like foxes in the wilderness. They do not go to Jerusalem and say to Jerusalem and prepare the walls of the city for the day of the Lord. Prepare the walls of the city for the day of the Lord? Wait a minute. If the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event, what good would it do to prepare the walls? You know, at the time Ezekiel wrote, Nebuchadnezzar had already come into Israel once. He had encircled the city, done damage to the wall. And now Ezekiel is telling Jerusalem and the inhabitants, if the prophets were really prophets like they ought to be, if they're prophets of the Lord, they ought to be here in the city, helping the city fortify the walls, repair the walls to prepare for the day of the Lord. Was Ezekiel saying, boy, you guys ought to be in this city preparing for the day of the Lord that won't happen for 2,800 years yet, or maybe more? You say how ridiculous that is? Okay, so now then, the Lord said they're going to run to the hills. They're going to hide in the rocks and in the caves. Now, folks, if you have your Bible, hope you do, I hope you check everything that I share with you. I hope you go and you look at the context. and that you make sure that what I'm saying is true. I don't mind at all being challenged if it's done in a respectful, courteous, decorous way. So anyway, Luke chapter 23. Jesus is being led out to his crucifixion. A bunch of the women who love him are following along, and they're weeping and they're wailing. And in Luke chapter 23, 26 and following, we find this. As they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and the women also mourned and lamented at him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Now, a real quick sidebar here. That terminology, you and your children, is every single time in the New Testament a one-generational statement. It's a temporal delimitation. In other words, it's a way for Jesus to say, weep for yourselves in this generation. It's a periphrasis. So Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed, the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, breasts which never nursed. And then when? When the women and their children would mourn. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Hey, that sounds kind of familiar. Right? Have you connected the dot here? Isaiah chapter 2, in the last days, day of the Lord, the men of Israel would run to the hills. By the way, that terminology, as I've shared with you before, of running to the hills, hiding in the rocks, hiding in the caves, is language taken directly from military war, from a time of invasion. You go back to the book of Judges, and you find it there, in which the Philistines or the Midianites or whoever invaded the land of Israel, and the children of Israel could not resist them. So what did they do? They ran to the hills. They hid in the caves. It is not end of time language, ladies and gentlemen. Now, here's what's interesting. Bible commentators very seldom agree altogether on much of anything. But I've been investigating this passage for years now, and while I certainly may have missed some commentator by someone somewhere, so far I have not found one single commentator who did not agree that Jesus was predicting the impending fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So what do we have? We have Isaiah predicting the last days, day of the Lord, when men would run to the mountains, hide in the caves, cry to the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the day of the Lord. Now, and by the way, that would be the time of the war, when Israel's men would fall by the edge of the sword, which Jesus applied to AD 70. So Jesus, being led out to his crucifixion, says to the women, he cites verbatim Isaiah 2:19-21 and the parallel, Hosea 10:8. And all commentators agree, Luke chapter 23, Jesus is talking about the impending destruction of Jerusalem. So here's Jesus living in the last days, quoting from a prophecy of the last days and applying it to his generation and the impending destruction of Jerusalem. So let me ask you a question. Upon what basis would you and I today say, well, yeah, okay, Jesus was applying Isaiah to his generation, but that doesn't mean that that's all that Isaiah was talking about. There are those who want to claim, well, yeah, AD 70 was a type and a shadow of the real coming of the Lord at the end of the Christian age, last days. I have been challenging those individuals who make that claim. Show me one verse. Show me one verse that says that. Okay? Show me one verse that demands that. I'm not asking for the explicit statement, AD 70 was a shadow of the yet future day of the Lord. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying, show me a text that demands that implicitly or any other way. You know what? I haven't had even one person offer a biblical text to justify that. They just keep repeating their little mantra. AD 70 was a type and a shadow of the real coming of the Lord. Well, I wrote a book on that entitled AD 70, a shadow of the parentheses real, parentheses end, question mark. In it, I adduced something like 15 points to prove that AD 70 was not a type or a shadow of anything beyond that. Do yourself a favor and get a copy of that. Okay, I'm out of time for today. Thank you so very much for joining me. I will continue this on the flip side.